about diversity, I think about race. It never occurred to me growing up that people who grew up in, say, Alabama or New York City were different from the people I grew up with. It was only after I got out into the world that I realized that I was different. Albarado, my last name is Spanish. I didn't learn until I was in college that my ancestors came to this country from the Canary Islands, which is a Spanish territory, and we came as farmers and soldiers as part of the Spanish colonization of what was then the Florida territory. My middle name is Antoine, which is French for Anthony, and my mother was a Boudreaux, which makes her French. Depending on where you trace the lineage, there's French and then there's Cajun. And you might think, well, Cajun is French, isn't it? Well, yes and no. Louisiana was settled by the French. And the Cajuns only came there afterwards because it was one of the safe places they could go after they were kicked out of Acadia, Nova Scotia, by the British. And some of the French who were Acadians went back to France. Some of them settled in places like Baltimore, parts of New York, and Louisiana, where, particularly in Louisiana, they grew up isolated, didn't really have any contact with the Anglais, the English, the Americans, until Louisiana became a state. And even then, one reason Cajun culture hung on as long as it did is because they lived out along the bayous and the really hard to get places in Louisiana. And didn't really have any contact with the outside world until the oil business boomed. And oil and logging became two big industries in Louisiana, and then suddenly you had all these English-speaking people. And English-speaking people, wealthier, more active in politics, took over state politics and state education, and basically outlawed French. So one reason you don't hear my accent, one reason I don't speak a word of French, well, I can say a few phrases, but one reason I never learned French, much less Spanish, is that my parents grew up in a generation where if you spoke French in school, you were punished for it. Usually that meant a caning with a cane rod or a ruler. So my parents grew up with this stigma that you don't want to appear Cajun, you don't want to appear French. So they didn't teach their kids how to speak French. And I took French in high school. I take it back, I didn't take French in high school because I was too busy playing in the band. I took French in college. Took one semester of German in college. I didn't take Spanish. Little did I know, I probably should have taken Spanish. But all of this brings me around to the reason why I think diversity is a key element of my 1 year as president of SPJ. SPJ has become more diverse. It is a very diverse organization. organization in terms of gender, in terms of race and ethnicity, and in terms of the types of journalists who belong to SPJ. At one time, SPJ was known basically as a print organization. It was just a bunch of white guys who worked for newspapers. Then TV came in, and TV people became part of it. But it was still a bunch of white guys who were either TV people or print journalists. It wasn't until 1979 that women could become members of SPJ. Think about that. So, it's important to me that SPJ make up for a lot of that lost time. And that's why diversity is such an important issue for me this year with SPJ. I have a very strong diversity committee. It's chaired by a young Hispanic woman. And it's composed of a number of people who are committed to the idea that SPJ practice what it preaches. One thing I can tell you about one of the programs we have is a diversity leadership program where we invite journalists to apply, journalists who may be in a minority, a racial minority or ethnic minority or gender orientation minority, or if they're a representative of some handicap population. Anyway, we invite them to apply for these fellowships, and what the fellowship does is it brings people who are potential leaders of SPJ, their local SPJ chapters or national SPJ, brings them to the national convention. It pays for their registration and other expenses. Doesn't pay for their travel, unfortunately. But it's one way that SPJ has been over the years, bringing more and more committed journalists, people who are committed to SPJ, into the organization, who can make the organization reflect the profession at large. And that's a key issue for me, that SPJ, although it has made great strides, still needs to become more reflective of the profession. One thing that's happened, and this has not so much to do with diversity, but SPJ, because of the changes in the journalism business, SPJ has become a much larger organization of freelance journalists. One of our most active committees is the freelance committee, because so many of our members either lost their jobs or they saw the handwriting on the wall and have moved into other types of journalism jobs or freelancing, and so they are happy to have a committee of SPJ that focuses on their needs. I'd like to kind of switch gears and talk about being a student and being part of SPJ, because I think it's important that you understand one fact. You'll notice that you are not members of the Society of Student Journalists. You're members of the Society of Professional Journalists. You don't belong to just another campus club. You're full members of the largest and oldest journalism organization in the country. In fact, when you commit journalism, when you cover an event and file a report about it, whether that report's on paper, on camera, over the web, or on Twitter, wherever, you are just as much a professional journalist as I am, or someone from an organization like CNN, or the Anniston Star, or Birmingham News. You are protected by the same Constitution as any other American. And that's the point I and the leaders of several other journalism groups made to the mayor of Atlanta last month when we asked him to use his office to stop the scheduled trial of 2 young journalists who were arrested at an Occupy Atlanta demonstration last November. These young women, one of them was a student at Georgia State, the other a student at Kennesaw State. They were targeted by police who arrested them and charged them with obstructing traffic. They were photographing and taking video of demonstrators and police while standing in the middle of a street that police had already closed to traffic. They weren't interfering with the police. They were not alone in the street. They were part of a crowd of other journalists. Despite the fact that they identified themselves as working journalists on assignment for their newspapers, one of them actually had a press credential. They were arrested and held in jail for 14 hours before being released. To add insult to injury, the charges against them were not immediately dropped, despite the fact that SPJ, the National Press Photographers Association, the Student Press Law Center, and other groups objected to their treatment. Atlanta city prosecutor fully intended to put these young women on trial in October this month, until the mayor intervened and the charges were dropped. Part of the reason the mayor intervened, I believe, and in fact he said so, was after he received letters from SPJ, the NPPA, and the SPLC, and others saying, really, this is ridiculous. These young women were working journalists. They were protected by the First Amendment. They should not have been arrested. They should not have been held. They definitely should not be put on trial. The point is that we made in our letters was that even though they were students, these journalists deserve the same free speech and free press protections as any other reporter, just as you do whenever you go out as a journalist. What sets you apart is the fact that you have chosen to belong to an organization and practice journalism under a code of responsibility and ethical decision-making that demands as much of you as it gives you the license to ask questions and serve as a witness. By the way, witness, that's what I believe journalists do. We're witnesses. We're witnesses to history. We're witnesses to what happens in a community, and we act as interpreters and presenters of information to our communities.